Hi, I thank the organizers for organizing this talk. Yeah, so animals living in social groups often exhibit collective motion, which helps in achieving various functions like uh, evasion from predators, foraging, and navigation. So, classic collective models, which were developed to understand uh, collective motion, assume that the organisms usually move in the average direction of their neighbors or move towards them. Oh, you need to connect it to a charge. Power is low.
Yes, power is there. Yes.
So basically, these broadly the computational and theoretical models showed that non-trivial group properties can be achieved through can emerge when organisms follow simple rules based on their neighbors. However, recent empirical studies have shown that animals interact through rules which are much simpler than local averaging. For example, it is shown that the fish interact with just a single neighbor chosen randomly, or it may be a nearest neighbor, or the most influential neighbor, which is determined by its position and orientation from the focal individual, and yet the polarization and cohesion can be achieved. And also in echolocating bats, when they are in large numbers, the returning echoes can be masked because of louder calls from the neighbors. So it is very when they're in large groups, usually the bats can even only perceive one neighbor at a time, but yet they still achieve cohesion. So we do understand that most of these rules can be species specific, but it is also important to ask how is the choice of neighbors help determine the cohesion, the group cohesion. So while the group polarization is fairly well understood, the mechanisms that result in group cohesion, particularly the randomness in choosing the neighbor, is not that well studied. So we develop an spatially explicit agent-based model to study the cohesion in collectively moving groups. So we broadly follow the rules of self-propelled particles, which is alignment, attraction, and spontaneous turning. But we make two key changes. That is, the interactions are probabilistic. That is, there is a probability for each of the interaction, and the interaction happen not continuously but asynchronously. Further, we also make one important change, that is how the neighbors are chosen. So, and what type of neighbors are chosen. So, first one, we call it like a nearest neighbor interaction, where the individual perceives only the nearest neighbor and interacts with it. However, there can be other ways. So in this case, the agent can perceive three or capital K neighbors, but will only choose one neighbor randomly to interact with. Or the other one, which is commonly used, where the neighbor sees, the focal individual perceives capital K individuals and interacts with all of them and moves in the average direction of its neighbors. So particularly we should focus on this case where the individual can perceive capital K neighbors, but it randomly selects one of them to interact with. Either it moves in that direction or it aligns to their orientation. So now we need to quantify group cohesion because that is our aim. So group cohesion can be quantified in various ways. That is their average near neighbor distance, or how far the neighbors are from the group centroid. But here we use a method where the group cohesion is based on we use a density based clustering approach. So here we define a cluster as set of agents, which a cluster is defined as a set of agents where every agent is at least is less than epsilon distance from its one of the neighbors in the cluster. So here we can see that the blue ones, all the blue dots are a cluster, and green dots because each individual there is within epsilon distance. So we define cohesion parameter as the size of the largest cluster divided by the group size. So larger the cohesion parameter, that is 1, the groups are always together. If it's less than 1, that means they're breaking, different clusters are formed. So this is, I'll show you the simulations of how the group evolves. Evolves with time when it interacts only with its nearest neighbors. We can see that the group started as a cohesive group, but then it's split into small groups of 3 and 5. However, when I increase the visual neighborhood, that is, it can see 5 of them and interacts with only one of them, we see that the groups are mostly cohesive, but often split and comes back. However, when the visual perceptible neighbor, it can perceive 9 agents and just interact with one of them, the group is cohesive most of the time. So we can see that when the group size is small, that is 5, most of the time they are cohesive. That is, the cohesion parameter is 1, or they form only one cluster, even when they interact with the nearest neighbor. However, as the group size increases, just the nearest neighbor is not sufficient. But as they can pursue more neighbors and yet just interacting with the nearest one, they can achieve higher cohesion. So as the visual topological neighborhood increases, the cohesion increases and also the number of clusters formed decreases. So now, to understand why cohesion emerges even through just simple pairwise interaction, we turn to graph theoretical analysis of the underlying interaction networks. So in this, we can consider each fish as a node, and then we can draw edge from each node to the fish or the agent it interacts with. So because the interactions are asynchronous, they happen at different times, so we need to construct this network over a time window, and this time window we choose from the intrinsic length scale and velocity scale of the system. So basically the time scale here is the average time it might take to move away from a cluster. So we see where all the interactions are happening, and over that window construct a network. So over the window we construct the network, and we can reasonably assume that a well-connected network implies that the group is cohesive, and if the interaction network is sparse, the group is not cohesive. So, and also the group is for them to be well connected, it need not mean that each individual should connect to every other individual. They can interact through the secondary or ternary interactions. So to incorporate this, what we do is we divide this group, whole group, into subgroups, and we define subgroup as that an individual is part of a subgroup if it has a path from it. So 2 individuals belong to a group if there is a path from I to J and there's also path from J to I. And to relate cohesion and this network parameter we are constructing, we define the network parameter as the size of the largest subgroup divided by the total group size. What we find is that the network parameter also follows the similar trend as cohesion. So as the neighborhood increases, the the subgroups form where there's connection from every organism to every other organism increases. So there is a possible. So this shows that there is a opportunity, even though the interactions are with just a randomly chosen neighbor, there is a chance for them to stay cohesive. Now we compare this result, that is interacting with just a randomly chosen neighbor from the visual neighborhood, to the when the organisms interact with all the neighbors. Basically they move in the average direction of their neighbors. So we see that here the similar trend is observed, but to achieve the same cohesion in terms of averaging interactions, you need lesser number of visually perceptible neighbors than to the pairwise. However, after a certain value, there is after a certain topological neighborhood, there is no much difference in the cohesion they can achieve. So basically, we show that group level cohesion can be achieved when organisms just randomly interact with a near neighbor. It need not be averaging, and also that this randomly choosing a neighbor creates a well-connected network that results in a cohesive groups. Thank you.
Thank you for that excellent talk. Is there any question from the audience? Okay. If not, I'll ask one question. So essentially what you're trying to say is that even though, you basically showed 2 or 3 models rather. So in one of the models, they were basically looking at one of the neighbors. What you were suggesting is that if you kind of take a longer time window, you are essentially doing time average instead of doing a spatial average. You essentially get very similar results when the number of neighbors is sufficient.
Yes.
Okay. Is there any other question from the audience? If not, please thank the speaker.